Set. Welcome to Legacy of Throne. Before we begin this incredible journey through history, power, and forgotten empires, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss our next epic story. On this channel, we uncover the rise of kings, hidden dynasties, untold wars, and the secrets that shape the world. Subscribe now, because history belongs to those who remember it. In 4,000 years of Chinese imperial history, only one woman has ever ruled the Middle Kingdom in her own name. Her story begins not with destiny, but with defiance against a world that declared such ambition impossible. The year is 705 AD in the imperial capital of Luoyang. Ministers gather in hushed conference rooms, plotting the downfall of their emperor. But this emperor is no weak prince or aging dynasty founder. This is Wu Zetian, a woman who has held absolute power for 15 years, commanding 50 million subjects across an empire that stretches from Korea to Central Asia. Her path to the Dragon Throne began 8 years earlier, in a world governed by laws as rigid as iron, where every person knew their place in heaven's grand design. This was the Tang dynasty at its zenith, when China considered itself the center of civilization. Surrounded by barbarian kingdoms that paid tribute to the Son of Heaven for a millennium, Confucian teaching had defined the natural order. Heaven above, earth below, emperor above, subjects below, man above, woman below. The woman follows. The man declared the ancient texts in youth. She follows her father in marriage. She follows her husband in widowhood. She follows her son to challenge. This was to challenge the fundamental structure of the universe itself. Yet in 624 AD, in a merchant's house in the provinces, a girl was born who would demolish these certainties. One by one, she would eliminate rivals, elevate peasants to power, and command armies. She would create governmental systems that outlasted dynasties and prove that intelligence and ruthlessness could triumph over every tradition whose actions' rise was neither accident nor seduction. It was the methodical conquest of power by someone who understood its mechanisms better than any man of her age. Her story reveals the revolutionary idea that merit, not gender, should determine who rules. It begins, as all such stories must, with a child who learned early that the world's rules were made by those strong enough to enforce them, and clever enough to rewrite them entirely. The future Empress was born into a world of opportunity disguised as limitation. Her father, she who had built his fortune selling timber. But his true genius lay in recognizing the winds of political change before they became hurricanes. When Lai Yuan rebelled against the dying Sui dynasty, the merchant threw his considerable wealth behind the insurgent cause. It was a gamble that would transform his family from provincial traders into members of the imperial elite. The rebellion succeeded spectacularly. Lai Yuan became Emperor Guthu, founder of the Tang dynasty, and the timber merchant found himself elevated to the rank of Duke of Yinchuan. More importantly, this elevation brought something money could not buy: access to the inner circles of imperial power. The duke's daughter would grow up in a household where ministers visited regularly, where court politics were discussed over dinner, and where the mechanisms of empire were laid bare. This proximity to power shaped the girl's earliest years in ways that would prove decisive. While most daughters of her era learned only domestic skills, the young Wu received an education unusual enough in itself, but made extraordinary by its quality. The duke, understanding that knowledge was the ultimate currency in Chinese governance, ensured his daughter mastered classical literature, history, and, most crucially, calligraphy. In a culture where the elegance of one's brushwork was considered a window into character and intellectual refinement, these skills would later open doors that remained closed to other women. But education was only part of the advantage. The Wu household served as a nexus of political intelligence, where the duke's merchant connections intersected with his newfound aristocratic status. Trade routes carried more than goods; they carried information. Merchants who had traveled to distant provinces would arrive at the residence with news of rebellions, natural disasters, administrative successes, and failures. The duke's daughter absorbed these lessons in statecraft as naturally as other children learned nursery rhymes. The duke died when his daughter was young, but not before instilling in the girl a fundamental understanding that would guide her entire life in the imperial system. Proximity to the emperor was everything. Distant relatives of the royal family lived in luxury, while brilliant scholars languished in poverty simply because one had access to imperial favor, while the other did not. The timber merchant had climbed from tradesman to duke by positioning himself correctly during a moment of dynastic change. His child would take this lesson and apply it with surgical precision. The family's rise had not gone unnoticed at court. By her 13th year, the young woman had developed a reputation for intelligence and beauty that reached the ears of palace officials responsible for recruiting concubines for the imperial harem. In any other family, this attention might have been unwelcome. The imperial harem was notorious for its intrigue and the short, often tragic lives of its inhabitants. But the duke's daughter understood what others missed. The harem was not a prison but a pathway to the center of power. Emperor Taizong, the second Tang emperor, was arguably the greatest ruler in Chinese history. Under his reign, the empire had expanded to unprecedented size while simultaneously achieving remarkable internal stability. He was a patron of learning, a military genius, and an administrator whose governmental innovations would influence Chinese politics for centuries. To be selected for his harem was to be placed at the very heart of the most powerful court on earth. The selection process was rigorous. Candidates were evaluated not merely for physical beauty, but for intelligence, cultural refinement, and family background. The merchant's daughter excelled in every category. Her calligraphy was exceptional, knowledge of classical literature, impressive, and the family's recent elevation to nobility satisfied the court's requirements for proper lineage. More importantly, this remarkable young woman possessed something that could not be taught: an intuitive understanding of how power operated and an unwavering determination to acquire it. At 14, the duke's daughter entered the Tiger Palace as a fifth-rank concubine, one of the lowest positions in the imperial harem's complex hierarchy to outside observers. This represented a remarkable elevation from provincial merchant's granddaughter to member of the emperor's household in a single generation, but the new concubine understood that gaining access was merely the first step. Now came the challenge of learning to play the game itself. The imperial harem contained hundreds of women, most of whom would live and die in obscurity, the names forgotten by history. They competed endlessly for the emperor's attention, knowing that imperial favor could elevate them to positions of influence, while neglecting mental lifetime of elegant imprisonment. Most approached this competition with the tools traditionally available to women: beauty, charm, and the hope of bearing an imperial son. The young concubine recognized immediately that this conventional approach was a trap. Beauty-faded charm could be dismissed as superficial, and pregnancy was as much a matter of luck as design. Instead, a different strategy emerged, making oneself indispensable not as a woman, but as an intelligent advisor. The teenager began to study the sovereign himself, not just his preferences in entertainment or companionship, but his concerns as a ruler, his policy challenges, his administrative frustrations. The emperor was a hands-on administrator who involved himself in the details of governance, to a degree that amazed his ministers. He read reports from provincial governors, reviewed judicial decisions, and personally interviewed candidates for official positions. The fifth-rank concubine positioned herself to assist with these tasks, demonstrating a grasp of policy details that impressed even experienced court officials. While other concubines entertained the monarch, this one informed him, while they sought to distract him from the burdens of rule. The merchant's daughter helped him bear them more effectively. This strategy required not just intelligence, but remarkable self-discipline. Here was a 15-year-old girl, surrounded by luxury and pageantry that would have dazzled most provincial daughters. Yet focus remained fixed on the long-term objective, transforming access into influence and influence into power. The young woman understood that the emperor's time was the most precious commodity in the empire, and made certain that the hours spent with this particular concubine were not merely pleasant, but useful. The approach succeeded beyond all expectations. Within 2 years, the low-ranking concubine had become one of the Tang ruler's most trusted informal advisors, consulted on matters ranging from personnel decisions to policy implementation. More significantly, something far more valuable than the emperor's romantic attention had been gained: intellectual respect in a court where women were expected to remain decoratively silent. The merchant's daughter had become a voice that the most powerful man in the world actively sought to hear. But even as this position with the current emperor was being consolidated, thoughts were already turning to the next phase of ascent. The sovereign was aging, and succession politics had begun to dominate court discussions. His heir apparent was least a thoughtful but physically frail prince who would eventually become emperor.
Gaussian.
While other court observers focused on which ministers might gain influence under the new regime, a different calculation was being made entirely. The young concubine began to cultivate a relationship with Prince Louis, carefully, discreetly, but with the same strategic precision that had won his father's confidence. It was a dangerous game. Imperial concubines were forbidden from having relationships with anyone other than the emperor, and the penalty for such conduct was death. But the merchant's daughter understood that the greatest risks often offered the greatest rewards. Assessment of League revealed a young man of considerable intelligence but limited confidence, someone who would benefit enormously from the guidance of a skilled advisor. More importantly, recognition dawned that his eventual succession would create opportunities for those positioned to help him navigate the challenges of imperial rule while maintaining duties to the current emperor. The delicate process began of ensuring survival and advancement in the next reign. The relationship that developed between the concubine and Prince League would ultimately change the course of Chinese history. But in those early years, it appeared to be simply another example of court intrigue, the kind of secret alliance that had characterized imperial politics for centuries. None of the experienced ministers and court observers who witnessed their discreet interactions could have imagined that they were watching the foundation being laid for the most revolutionary reign in Chinese history. As the Tang ruler's health began to decline, the merchant's daughter found herself in a position unprecedented for a woman of that era, simultaneously trusted by the current emperor and cultivating the favor of his successor. The teenage years had been spent not in the frivolous pursuits typically associated with palace women, but in acquiring the skills and relationships that would soon make this concubine the most powerful woman in the world. The duke's daughter had learned to think like an emperor. Now came the test of whether the strength existed to become one. The imperial harem was a world unto itself, governed by rules as complex and unforgiving as any battlefield within the walls of the Tagian palace. Hundreds of women lived in a carefully orchestrated hierarchy, where rank determined everything from the quality of one's quarters to the frequency of imperial visits. From the deference shown by servants to the hope of bearing children who might inherit the dragon throne, the new fifth-rank concubine entered this world with advantages that most inhabitants lacked, while other women had been selected primarily for beauty or family connections. The merchant's daughter possessed something far more valuable, a keen understanding of power dynamics learned at her father's knee. The duke had risen from timber trader to imperial nobility by reading political currents correctly. His daughter would apply the same skills to navigate the treacherous waters of palace intrigue. Life in the harem followed rhythms as precise as any imperial ceremony. Dawn brought ritual ablutions and careful preparation of appearance, for one never knew when the emperor might summon a particular concubine. Days were filled with music lessons, poetry recitation, embroidery, and the endless subtle competition for favorable position within the hierarchy. Evenings often brought entertainment for the sovereign, elaborate performances where concubines displayed their cultural refinements in hopes of capturing imperial attention. Most women approached these rituals with a mixture of hope and resignation. They understood that their lives depended entirely on the emperor's favor, yet they had little control over when that favor might be granted or withdrawn. Beauty was their primary asset, supplemented by whatever talents they could display in music, dance, or poetry. Success meant elevation and rank, better living quarters, and the possibility of bearing an imperial heir failure meant a lifetime of elegant, obscure. Growing old in chambers that grew smaller and less comfortable with each passing year, the duke's daughter recognized immediately that this conventional approach was fundamentally flawed. Beauty was temporary, talent could be replicated, and the birth of children remained largely a matter of chance. More critically, these traditional paths to imperial favor positioned women as entertainers rather than advisors, as decorative objects rather than trusted confidants. Such relationships, however intense, remained fundamentally superficial and could be severed at the emperor's whim. Instead, a different strategy began to emerge. The young concubine made herself useful in ways that transcended the traditional roles of harem women. When the emperor worked late reviewing memorials from provincial governors, this particular concubine proved capable of organizing documents efficiently and even offering insights into regional conditions when administrative decisions required careful consideration. The merchant's daughter demonstrated an understanding of policy implications that impressed courtiers who had served the throne for decades. This approach required extraordinary self-discipline and strategic thinking. The teenager was surrounded by luxury and pageantry that would have overwhelmed most provincial girls. Silk robes replaced simple cotton garments. Elaborate meals appeared at scheduled intervals. Servants attended to every need. Gardens of exquisite beauty provided venues for contemplation and exercise. Yet focus remained fixed on the long-term objective, transforming access into influence. The emperor's daily routine provided the framework for this campaign. The Tang ruler rose before dawn to review reports from across his vast empire. Provincial governors submitted regular accounts of local conditions, crop yields, tax collections, bandit activities, natural disasters. Military commanders reported on border security and the movements of potentially hostile neighbors. Court officials provided updates on administrative efficiency and the implementation of imperial edicts. Managing this constant flow of information required skills that few people possessed. The emperor needed not just literacy, but the ability to synthesize complex data quickly and identify patterns that might indicate emerging problems or opportunities. He required advisors who could grasp the implications of seemingly minor developments and suggest appropriate responses. The fifth-rank concubine positioned herself to assist with these critical tasks, while other women prepared elaborate entertainments designed to distract the sovereign from his burdens. This one helped him bear those burdens more effectively. When reports arrived describing drought conditions in distant provinces, the young woman could discuss the likely impact on tax revenues and suggest adjustments to imperial policies when military dispatches indicated increased activity along northern borders. The concubine demonstrated familiarity with tribal politics and trade relationships that might explain the movements. This knowledge had not been acquired by accident. The merchant's daughter had grown up in a household where information flowed constantly from trade networks that spanned the empire. Timber merchants dealt with officials in dozens of provinces. They understood regional variations in weather patterns, local political dynamics, and the competence of various administrators. They heard gossip about which governors were honest and which were corrupt, which military commanders were effective and which were incompetent. More importantly, the duke's daughter had absorbed lessons in how information could be transformed into influence. Successful merchants survived by understanding their customers' needs and positioning themselves as indispensable suppliers. The same principles applied to court politics. The emperor's greatest need was for accurate, timely intelligence about conditions throughout his realm. By meeting these needs more effectively than traditional advisors, the young concubine gradually made herself invaluable. The strategy succeeded beyond all reasonable expectations. Within 18 months, the low-ranking harem member had become one of the emperor's most trusted informal counselors. Ministers who had initially dismissed the teenager as merely another pretty face began to recognize that this particular woman possessed insights that could enhance their own effectiveness. Court officials started consulting the concubine about policy matters, knowing that her recommendations often aligned with imperial preferences. More significantly, the emperor himself began to rely on these consultations. The sovereign was a hands-on administrator who prided himself on personal involvement in governmental decisions. He interviewed candidates for official positions, personally reviewed judicial verdicts that involved significant penalties, and maintained direct correspondence with provincial governors. This level of engagement required enormous amounts of time and energy. An advisor who could help manage these responsibilities efficiently became indispensable. Yet, even as this remarkable position was being consolidated, the merchant's daughter remained acutely aware of its limitations. Imperial favor, however deep, remained ultimately fragile. Emperors aged, died, and were succeeded by heirs who might have entirely different preferences and priorities. Concubines who had enjoyed great influence under one reign often found themselves marginalized or worse under the next. History provided numerous examples of powerful women who had failed to survive dynastic transitions. The solution lay in cultivating relationships that would extend beyond the current emperor's lifetime. Prince Liege, heir apparent to the Tang throne, represented the key to long-term survival and advancement. The challenge was establishing meaningful contact with the prince while maintaining absolute discretion about such interactions. Imperial protocol strictly forbade romantic relationships between concubines and anyone other than the emperor. The penalty for violating this prohibition was death, typically carried out with elaborate public ceremony designed to reinforce the sanctity of imperial prerogatives. Yet the duke's daughter understood that the greatest opportunities often required accepting the greatest risks. The heir apparent was a complex young man, intellectually gifted but physically frail. Thoughtful but lacking in confidence, he had received an excellent education but possessed limited, practical experience in governance. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in the welfare of his future subjects rather than merely the privileges of imperial power. These characteristics suggested that the prince would benefit enormously from the guidance of skilled advisors and might prove receptive to unconventional counsel. The process began with seemingly casual encounters in palace gardens and corridors. The prince often walked alone, seeking solitude from the constant attention of courtiers and tutors during these moments. Chance meetings could occur that appeared entirely innocent to outside observers. A concubine might be gathering flowers for the emperor's chambers. A prince might pause to admire particularly beautiful blossoms. Polite conversation about poetry or philosophy could follow naturally from such encounters. These brief exchanges revealed a young man hungry for intellectual companionship with someone who was not constantly seeking favor or advantage. The merchant's daughter offered something the crown prince had rarely experienced: genuine conversation, with a person whose primary objective was understanding rather than advancement. The discussions ranged across topics from classical literature to administrative theory, from military strategy to the challenges of governing a diverse empire. Gradually, a relationship developed that was unlike anything either participant had previously experienced to the heir apparent. The concubine represented a confidant who could discuss complex ideas without the formal constraints that governed most court interactions. For the duke's daughter, the prince offered access to the inner workings of imperial decision-making, an insight into the challenges that would define the next reign. Both understood the enormous risks involved in these clandestine meetings. Discovery would mean death for the concubine and severe consequences for the future emperor. Yet both also recognized that their relationship offered possibilities that conventional court alliances could never provide. They were laying the foundations for a partnership that would ultimately reshape Chinese history. As the emperor's health began to show signs of decline, succession planning became an increasingly prominent concern throughout the palace. Ministers positioned themselves to gain influence under the new regime. Military commanders sought to demonstrate their loyalty to the heir apparent. Provincial governors began corresponding directly with the crown prince, as well as his father. The merchant's daughter found herself uniquely positioned within these evolving dynamics. Her relationship with the current emperor provided access to information about succession planning and imperial preferences regarding the transition. Her growing connection with the future sovereign offered insight into the prince's thinking and the advisors who might gain prominence in the next reign. Most importantly, both relationships were based on genuine intellectual partnership rather than mere flattery or opportunism. This dual positioning required extraordinary skill in managing conflicting loyalties and maintaining absolute discretion. The concubine continued to serve the current emperor faithfully, providing the administrative assistance and policy insights that had made her invaluable. Simultaneous careful cultivation of the relationship with the heir apparent continued, always with meticulous attention to avoiding discovery. The strategy was working perfectly. The merchant's daughter had transformed herself from a low-ranking concubine into one of the most influential women in the empire. But the greatest test still lay ahead. When the emperor died and the crown prince ascended to the throne, everything would change. The foundation was being laid for the most remarkable political ascent in Chinese history, but success would require navigating challenges that no woman had ever faced before. The silent years were ending. Soon, the world would discover what the duke's daughter had learned to become. Death arrived for the Tang sovereign in the summer of 649, ending 23 years of rule that had elevated China to unprecedented heights of power and prosperity. The funeral ceremonies lasted for months, displaying imperial grandeur, while the machinery of succession operated with practiced efficiency. Prince Lai ascended the throne as Emperor Gaozong, and the empire barely paused in its daily rhythms of administration and conquest for the women of the imperial harem. However, dynastic transition meant catastrophe. Confucian law demanded the deceased ruler's concubines and to Buddhist convents, where they would spend their remaining years in religious contemplation. This ancient custom served multiple purposes. It prevented former concubines from interfering in palace politics, eliminated potential claims to imperial favor from the previous reign, and demonstrated proper respect for the departed sovereign's memory. The merchant's daughter faced this fate alongside hundreds of other women within weeks of the funeral. They were transported to Ganesha Temple outside the capital, their heads shaved, their silk robes replaced with rough hemp garments. The transition from palace luxury to monastic austerity was deliberately harsh, designed to sever all connections with their former lives. Most would never leave the temple walls again. Yet the duke's daughter possessed advantages that distinguished her from fellow exiles. Her secret relationship with the new sovereign provided hope for eventual rescue, though she understood that any such intervention would require careful timing and compelling justification. Meanwhile, the temple environment offered unexpected opportunities for intellectual development that would prove invaluable in future years. Ganja Temple housed one of China's finest libraries, assembled over centuries by scholarly monks and generous donors. The collection included historical texts, philosophical treatises, administrative manuals, and legal documents that provided comprehensive education in statecraft. While other former concubines resigned themselves to routine religious observances, the merchant's daughter immersed herself in systematic study of governance, law, and political theory. Buddhist monasteries maintained extensive correspondence networks that carried information across vast distances. Monks traveled freely between temples, sharing news from provincial capitals and frontier regions. Wealthy merchants and officials often visited temples for spiritual guidance, bringing gossip about court politics and administrative developments. The duke's daughter cultivated these sources carefully, gradually assembling a detailed picture of conditions throughout the empire. 2 years passed before Emperor Gaozong acted to retrieve the woman who had become his closest confidant during his father's reign. The delay was calculated rather than accidental. Sufficient time had elapsed to demonstrate proper respect for his predecessor, while the young ruler had gained experience that confirmed his need for trusted advisors. When imperial messengers finally arrived at Kanya Temple, they carried orders that shocked the Buddhist community. One former concubine would return to palace service. The justification offered for this unprecedented decision revealed careful political calculation. Palace records indicated that the woman in question possessed exceptional administrative skills that could benefit imperial governance. Her family connections provided valuable intelligence network throughout the provinces. Most significantly, her years and religious retreat had presumably purified any inappropriate attachments from the previous reign, making her return theologically acceptable. Religious authorities objected strenuously to this departure from established custom. Senior monks argued that removing a consecrated nun violated Buddhist law and set dangerous precedents for future reigns. Confucian scholars expressed horror at the breach of ancestral traditions that had governed dynastic transitions for centuries. Court officials worried about the political implications of restoring a former concubine to positions of influence. Emperor Gaozong ignored all protests. The timber merchant's daughter returned to the palace in early 652, officially designated as a second-rank concubine, a dramatic elevation from her previous fifth-rank status. More importantly, she was immediately granted private audiences with the sovereign and consulted on administrative matters that traditionally remained within the exclusive purview of male ministers. The imperial harem that awaited her return had been transformed by the succession. Gaozong had married Empress Wang, a woman from one of China's most prestigious aristocratic families, whose primary qualification was her impeccable bloodline rather than personal capabilities. Consort Shao, the emperor's favored secondary wife, possessed considerable beauty and cultural refinement, but limited interest in political affairs. Both women had assumed that the young ruler's romantic and intellectual needs would be met within this conventional arrangement. The appearance of a former concubine who commanded immediate imperial attention disrupted these comfortable assumptions. The Empress quickly recognized that the returnee posed a fundamental threat to her position, not merely as a potential romantic rival, but as someone who could provide the emperor with intellectual partnership that his current wife could not match. The secondary consort, initially less concerned, became more concerned as the situation developed. Gradually understood that her own favored status depended on the emperor's continued satisfaction with existing arrangements. Palace intrigue intensified as the three women maneuvered for advantage within the imperial household. Wang possessed the strongest formal position. Her marriage had been arranged to cement political alliances between the imperial family and powerful aristocratic clans, giving her substantial support among court officials. The favored concubine enjoyed the emperor's obvious affection and had borne him children, creating maternal claims that could prove decisive in future succession disputes. The merchant's daughter held seemingly weaker cards, no aristocratic connections, no children, and the stigma of having served the previous emperor. Yet she possessed capabilities that neither rival could match. Her administrative expertise made her genuinely useful to a ruler struggling with the complexities of governing an empire that spanned continents. Her intelligence networks provided information about provincial conditions that proved more accurate than official reports. Most crucially, she offered intellectual companionship that the emperor valued more highly than conventional feminine attractions. The competition between these women would reshape palace dynamics and ultimately determine the course of Chinese history. But first, the returnee from Guna Temple faced an immediate challenge, establishing her position within the harem hierarchy while avoiding the mistakes that had destroyed countless palace women before her. Imperial favor alone could not guarantee survival in the treacherous environment of court politics. The merchant's daughter needed to build broader support networks, eliminate potential threats, and position herself for long-term advancement. Her rivals possessed formidable advantages and would not surrender their positions without determined resistance. The first phase of this struggle centered on securing the emperor's exclusive attention. Kuang was a conscientious ruler who worked long hours on administrative matters, but he was also a young man in need of personal companionship and emotional support. His marriage to Empress Wang had been arranged for political purposes and provided little personal satisfaction. His relationship with consort Xiao, while genuine, was based primarily on physical attraction rather than intellectual compatibility. The former, none offered something entirely different, a partnership that combined personal intimacy with professional collaboration. When the emperor struggled with complex policy decisions, she could provide insights based on extensive reading and information gathering. When diplomatic crises arose, her understanding of regional politics proved invaluable. When administrative reforms required implementation, her organizational skills ensured efficient execution. This approach succeeded brilliantly within months of her return. The merchant's daughter had become the emperor's most trusted advisor and closest companion. Palace observers noted that imperial summons arrived for her at all hours. The private conferences extended well beyond normal meeting times, and that her recommendations consistently influenced imperial decisions. Success, however, bred resentment among established palace factions. The Empress's supporters argued that elevating a former concubine to positions of influence violated protocol and undermined imperial dignity. Cao's allies warned that the emperor's obvious infatuation threatened the stability of existing arrangements. Ministers who had expected to dominate the young ruler's decision-making process found themselves bypassed in favor of a woman whose background they considered inappropriate. Opposition crystallized around a central theme. The returnee from Guna Temple represented a dangerous departure from established customs that had governed Chinese imperial politics for centuries. Her elevation threatened not merely individual positions, but the entire system of aristocratic privilege and male dominance that defined court culture. The merchant's daughter understood that this opposition would eventually organize into active resistance, unless she could preempt such efforts. Defensive strategies would prove insufficient. She needed to take offensive action that would eliminate threats before they could mature into genuine dangers. The solution lay in exploiting the vulnerabilities of her rivals while simultaneously strengthening her own position. The imperial wife's greatest weakness was her inability to provide the emperor with intellectual partnership or administrative assistance. The secondary consort's limitation was her focus on personal pleasure rather than political advancement. Both women had grown complacent about their positions and failed to recognize how quickly imperial favor could shift. The campaign that followed would demonstrate the merchant's daughter's mastery of palace intrigue and her willingness to employ any methods necessary to achieve her objectives. The stakes could not have been higher. Success would bring unprecedented power for a woman in Chinese history, while failure would certainly mean death. The transformation from exiled nun to imperial favorite had been accomplished through intelligence, determination, and careful calculation. Now came the ultimate test. Could a timber merchant's daughter destroy an empress and claim the most powerful position available to any woman in the Chinese empire? The answer would reshape not merely one life, but the destiny of a civilization. The destruction of rivals required methods that would have horrified the merchant's daughter's father. Yet the Duke had taught his child that survival demanded adapting to circumstances beyond one's control. Palace intrigue operated by rules as merciless as any battlefield, where hesitation meant death and sentimentality ensured defeat. The campaign began with careful observation of weaknesses. Wang possessed formal status, but lacked the intellectual gifts necessary to maintain lasting influence over a ruler who valued competence above ceremony. Her aristocratic background, while providing initial advantages, had never required her to develop the skills needed for active political maneuvering. Zhao commanded genuine affection, but remained fundamentally passive content to enjoy imperial favor without seeking to expand or secure a position. Both women shared a fatal flaw. They underestimated their opponent. The returnee from Ghana, Temple appeared to pose only romantic competition, not existential threat. This miscalculation would prove devastating. The first phase involved isolating the Empress from her support networks. Wang's strength lay in her family connections and the backing of conservative court factions who preferred traditional arrangements. The former nun began spreading carefully crafted rumors about the imperial wife's inability to produce male heirs, suggesting that heaven itself had withdrawn approval from the marriage. Palace servants, rewarded for their discretion, reported private conversations where the Empress expressed frustration with her husband's growing distance. Simultaneously, a different strategy emerged for neutralizing the secondary consort rather than attacking Zhao directly. The merchant's daughter began positioning herself as the more suitable partner for bearing future emperors. Medical consultations were arranged with court physicians who confirmed her excellent health and fertility. Astrological readings commissioned from respected scholars indicated that children born to the former concubine would enjoy particularly favorable destinies. The emperor, struggling with the complexities of governing an empire that stretched across continents, found himself increasingly dependent on the administrative expertise of his most capable advisor. Military campaigns required coordinating supplies across vast distances. Tax collection demanded understanding regional variations in agricultural productivity. Diplomatic negotiations with neighboring kingdoms involved intricate protocols that few officials had mastered completely. The Duke's daughter had spent her years in religious retreat, studying exactly these challenges. Her systematic examination of historical precedents provided solutions to problems that had puzzled experienced ministers. Her information networks, cultivated through merchant connections and temple correspondence, offered intelligence that proved more accurate than official reports. Her organizational abilities ensured that imperial decisions were implemented efficiently throughout the bureaucracy. Within months, the former nun had become indispensable to daily governance. Palace observers noted that no significant policy decisions were made without consulting her opinion. Foreign ambassadors began requesting private audiences, recognizing that her recommendations carried decisive weight with the sovereign. Provincial governors started submitting reports directly to her office. Understanding that her analysis would determine imperial responses, this exposed influence created opportunities for eliminating opposition more systematically. Court appointments could be influenced to favor officials who supported the merchant's daughter's position, while marginalizing those who remained loyal to her rivals. Financial allocations could be adjusted to reward provinces whose governors demonstrated appropriate deference. Military assignments could be arranged to place reliable commanders in strategic positions. The Empress found herself increasingly isolated as former allies discovered that opposing the Emperor's favored advisor damaged their own prospects for advancement. Ministers, who had initially supported Wang's position, began distancing themselves. Recognizing that their careers depended on maintaining good relationships with a woman who had gained such extraordinary influence over imperial decision-making, the secondary consort faced different pressures. Her relationship with the ruler had been based primarily on personal attraction and emotional comfort, rather than political partnership. As Gao Zong became more absorbed in governmental responsibilities, he had less time for purely recreational companionship. The sophisticated administrative discussions that occupied his attention required intellectual capabilities that she now had never developed. The crisis that would reshape the imperial household arrived unexpectedly, in the form of a personal tragedy that became a political weapon. The former concubine gave birth to a daughter in late 654. Providing the emperor with additional proof of her fertility and heaven's approval of their relationship. The child was healthy and beautiful, representing hope for future male heirs who might strengthen the dynasty. Within days of the birth, however, the infant was found dead in her crib. Palace physicians could determine no cause for the sudden death, but suspicion immediately fell on the Empress and her supporters. The grieving mother accused Wang of murdering the child out of jealousy, claiming that the imperial wife had access to the baby's chambers and motive for eliminating a potential threat to her position. The accusation created a crisis that divided the court into hostile factions. Wang's supporters argued that the charges were fabricated, designed to destroy the Empress through false accusations. They pointed out that the former concubine had both opportunity and motive to kill her own child. If such a death could be used to eliminate her primary rival, conservative officials warned that accepting such charges without concrete evidence would establish dangerous precedents for future palace disputes. The merchant's daughter's allies responded with their own investigation, producing witnesses who testified to having seen the Empress near the infant's quarters. On the night of the death, servants reported suspicious behavior and overheard conversations that suggested premeditation. Palace guards confirmed that Wang had dismissed her usual attendants and moved through the imperial residence without proper escort. Emperor Gaozong found himself trapped between conflicting loyalties and uncertain evidence. His marriage to the Empress had been arranged to secure political alliances that remained crucial to imperial stability. Destroying Wang would offend powerful aristocratic families whose support the dynasty needed. Yet his emotional attachment to the former concubine made him desperate to believe her accusations and punish those responsible for his daughter's death. The resolution came through a brilliant stroke of political theater. The former nun announced that she had received divine guidance through Buddhist meditation, revealing that heaven itself had withdrawn protection from the imperial marriage due to the Empress's moral failings. The infant's death was punishment for allowing a woman of corrupt character to occupy the position of imperial wife. Only by removing Wang from her position could the emperor restore heaven's favor and ensure the dynasty's survival. This religious interpretation provided the justification needed to overcome political obstacles. Conservative officials who might have defended the Empress on procedural grounds could not argue against divine judgment. Aristocratic families who had supported Wang's position found themselves unable to challenge heavenly mandates without appearing to oppose the fundamental principles of imperial legitimacy. The emperor, convinced of his favorite innocence and influenced by her religious authority, ordered a formal investigation into the Empress's conduct. The proceedings were carefully orchestrated to produce the desired outcome. Witnesses testified to Wang's jealous behavior and suspicious activities. Documents were presented suggesting that the imperial wife had consulted with fortune-tellers about methods for eliminating rivals. Physical evidence was discovered linking the Empress to the infant's death. The verdict was predetermined, but the legal process provided necessary legitimacy for the unprecedented action that followed. In 655, Emperor Gaozong formally deposed Wang from her position as Empress, simultaneously stripping Shao of her rank as secondary consort. Both women were banished from the palace and confined to a remote mansion under house arrest. Their political careers destroyed and their lives effective ended. The positions thus vacated required immediate filling to maintain the stability of imperial household arrangements. The emperor's choice surprised no one who had observed palace dynamics over the previous 3 years. The former concubine, who had orchestrated the destruction of her rivals, was elevated to the position of empress consort, becoming the most powerful woman in the Chinese empire. The transformation was complete. A timber merchant's daughter had eliminated an aristocratic empress and a favored consort through a combination of political maneuvering, religious manipulation, and calculated ruthlessness. The methods employed had been brutal, but the results were undeniable. She now occupied the highest position available to any woman in Chinese society. Yet this achievement was merely the beginning. The new empress understood that her position remained vulnerable to challenge unless she could establish complete control over the mechanisms of imperial power. The elimination of Wang and Shao had created opportunities for other ambitious individuals to seek advancement through opposition to her rule. The dynasty itself required strong leadership to maintain its expansion and prosperity. The former nun who had become empress consort was preparing to transform herself once again, this time into the effective ruler of the most powerful empire on earth. The skills that had elevated her from concubine to empress would now be applied to the even greater challenge of governing 50 million subjects across the territory that spanned continents. The merchant's daughter had learned to destroy rivals. Now she would discover whether she possessed the capabilities necessary to rule a civilization. The new empress faced challenges that transcended the palace intrigues which had brought her to power. Ruling the Tang Empire required managing a bureaucracy of unprecedented complexity, coordinating military campaigns across vast frontiers, and maintaining the delicate balance between central authority and provincial autonomy that had enabled Chinese civilization to flourish for centuries. Gao Song's health began deteriorating within months of his wife's elevation, creating opportunities that the former concubine seized with characteristic decisiveness. The emperor suffered from severe headaches and episodes of dizziness that left him unable to focus on administrative details for extended periods. Palace physicians offered various treatments, but none provided lasting relief from symptoms that grew progressively worse. These medical problems opened pathways to power that no woman in Chinese history had previously explored. When the sovereign found himself unable to review lengthy reports from provincial governors, his wife stepped forward to summarize key points and recommend appropriate responses. When diplomatic crises required immediate attention during periods of imperial incapacity, the Empress assumed responsibility for crafting replies that would maintain China's international prestige. The transition from informal advisor to actual ruler occurred gradually, almost imperceptibly, to outside observers. Palace officials, who had grown accustomed to consulting the Empress on policy matters, began submitting documents directly to her office. When the emperor's condition prevented normal procedures, military commanders sought her approval for troop movements and strategic deployments. Provincial administrators started addressing their correspondence to both imperial majesties. Understanding that effective responses required input from the person who had become the dynasty's true decision-maker. This expanding authority demanded new mechanisms of control that would ensure loyalty throughout the vast governmental apparatus. The Empress began developing an intelligence network that surpassed anything previous dynasties had imagined possible. Trusted agents were placed in every government department, every military unit, every provincial administration. These operatives reported directly to the Imperial consort, providing her with detailed information about the activities, conversations, and loyalties of officials throughout the empire. The system operated through a combination of rewards and threats that made resistance extremely dangerous. Officials who demonstrated appropriate deference found their careers advancing rapidly, their families receiving imperial favor, their recommendations being implemented with remarkable efficiency. Those who showed signs of opposition discovered that their past actions were being scrutinized intensively, their financial dealings investigated thoroughly, their personal associations examined for evidence of disloyalty. Fear became the Empress's most effective instrument of governance. Court officials understood that expressing doubt about her authority could result in exile, imprisonment, or death. Military commanders recognized that questioning her strategic decisions might lead to accusations of treason. Provincial governors learned that failing to implement her policies precisely would bring swift and severe consequences. Yet terror alone could not sustain effective administration across an empire that stretched from Korea to Central Asia. The new ruler also demonstrated remarkable competence in the practical challenges of governance, earning grudging respect even from officials who resented her unprecedented authority. Agricultural policies implemented under her direction increased crop yields throughout the empire. The Empress understood that China's prosperity depended on maintaining adequate food supplies for its enormous population, and she devoted considerable attention to irrigation projects, seed distribution programs, and techniques for improving soil fertility. Provincial reports indicated that famine, which had periodically devastated various regions, became increasingly rare during her period of influence. Military campaigns conducted under her oversight expanded Chinese territory while strengthening border defenses. The Empress possessed an intuitive grasp of strategic principles that impressed experienced generals. She understood the importance of maintaining supply lines across vast distances, coordinating movements between multiple armies, and exploiting enemy weaknesses through careful timing of offensive operations. Diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms improved significantly, as foreign rulers recognized that the Tang Empire was being governed by someone who combined ruthless determination with sophisticated understanding of international politics. The Empress cultivated alliances that served Chinese interests while avoiding conflicts that might drain imperial resources unnecessarily. Perhaps most significantly, she began implementing administrative reforms that would outlast her own reign and influence Chinese governance for centuries. The examination system for selecting government officials was expanded and systematized, ensuring that competent individuals from humble backgrounds could advance to positions of authority based on merit rather than aristocratic connections. The complaint box system she established allowed common people to petition the imperial government directly, bypassing local officials who might suppress legitimate grievances. This innovation provided the central administration with valuable information about conditions throughout the empire, while demonstrating that the dynasty cared about the welfare of ordinary subjects. Legal reforms improved the status of women in inheritance disputes and marriage arrangements, though these changes were implemented gradually to avoid provoking conservative opposition. The Empress understood that her own position depended partly on maintaining social stability, yet she also recognized opportunities to advance the interests of her gender within existing legal frameworks. Cultural achievements flourished under her patronage. The Long Men grottos, massive Buddhist cave complexes carved into cliffsides near Set, the capital, were commissioned during this period and represent some of the finest artistic accomplishments in Chinese history. These monuments served multiple purposes. They demonstrated imperial piety, provided employment for thousands of craftsmen, and created lasting symbols of the dynasty's cultural sophistication. Buddhist monasteries received generous imperial support, both as expressions of religious devotion and as counterweights to Confucian influence within the governmental apparatus. The Empress understood that Buddhist philosophy, with its emphasis on individual merit and spiritual achievement, provided better justification for her unprecedented authority than traditional Confucian teachings about hierarchical social relationships. The patronage of Buddhism also enabled the ruler to cultivate support among segments of the population that might otherwise have remained indifferent to political developments. Buddhist merchants, scholars, and clergy became valuable allies who helped legitimize her authority through religious arguments, rather than purely political ones. Opposition to the Empress's expanding power came primarily from conservative court factions, who viewed her influence as a dangerous departure from established traditions. These officials argued that allowing a woman such extensive authority violated fundamental principles of Chinese governance and threatened the dynasty's legitimacy in the eyes of heaven. The response to such criticism was swift and devastating. Officials who openly challenged the Empress's authority found themselves accused of corruption, incompetence, or treason. Evidence supporting these charges was invariably discovered by her intelligence agents, who had developed remarkable skill in uncovering compromising information about potential opponents. Public trials of dissenting officials served as warnings to others who might consider resistance. The proceedings were conducted with legal formality, but the outcomes were predetermined. Sentences ranged from exile to execution, depending on the severity of the alleged offenses and the need to send appropriate messages to surviving members of the court. Families of condemned officials faced collective punishment designed to discourage future opposition. Property was confiscated. Relatives were stripped of their positions, and social ostracism made it difficult for survivors to rebuild their lives. These harsh measures ensured that challenging the Empress's authority carried consequences that extended far beyond individual punishment. The emperor's declining health accelerated the concentration of power in his wife's hands. By 660,000, was experiencing periods of near-complete incapacity, during which the empress assumed full responsibility for governing the empire. Palace announcements attributed imperial decisions to both sovereigns jointly, but informed observers understood that effective authority had shifted entirely to the former concubine. This transition created new challenges and opportunities. Conservative officials, who had accepted the empress's influence as a temporary accommodation to the emperor's medical problems, began questioning whether such arrangements could continue indefinitely. Some started exploring alternatives that might restore traditional governmental structures without directly confronting the increasingly powerful ruler. The empress recognized that her position would become vulnerable if the emperor died, while their children remained too young to inherit the throne. Regency arrangements might provide opportunities for opponents to limit her authority or remove her from power entirely. She needed to strengthen her control over key institutions before such challenges could emerge. Military loyalty was secured through systematic replacement of potentially unreliable commanders, with officers who owed their advancement to imperial favor. The palace guard was staffed entirely with soldiers whose families had received special benefits from the empress's patronage. Provincial armies were rotated regularly to prevent local commanders from developing independent power bases. Bureaucratic control was maintained through the intelligence network that monitored official activities throughout the empire. No significant decision could be made. No important meeting could be held. No private conversation could take place without the Empress's agents learning of the details. Within days or weeks, economic leverage was established through careful management of imperial finances and strategic distribution of government positions. The Empress understood that loyalty could be purchased as well as compelled, and she used the empire's vast resources to reward supporters while punishing opponents. By the mid-60s, the merchant's daughter had transformed herself into the effective ruler of the most powerful empire on Earth. Her authority extended across continents, commanding the obedience of millions of subjects and the respect of foreign kingdoms. The methods employed to achieve this position had been ruthless, but the results were undeniable. Yet even greater challenges lay ahead. The emperor's death would create succession crises that could destabilize the entire dynasty. Conserving of opposition was growing more organized and determined. Foreign enemies were testing Chinese resolve along distant frontiers. The former concubine, who had become empress, was preparing for the ultimate test of her abilities. Soon, she would discover whether the skills that had elevated her to unprecedented power was sufficient to maintain that authority against all who would challenge her right to rule. Death claimed Emperor Gosen in December 683, ending a reign that had witnessed the unprecedented rise of female power within the imperial system. The sovereign's final years had been marked by increasing dependency on his wife's administrative capabilities, creating a situation where the transition of authority had already occurred in all but formal recognition. Yet the legal requirements of succession demanded adherence to established protocols that threatened to undo everything the empress had achieved. Confucian law was explicit about imperial inheritance. The throne, passed to the eldest surviving son, who would rule with the guidance of appointed regents until reaching full maturity. The empress's own children, Li Jie and Li Dan, were the designated as, but both remained young men whose political experience was limited and whose loyalty to their mother could not be guaranteed once they assumed imperial authority. The immediate succession crisis revealed the fundamental contradiction between the empress's actual power and her formal position within the governmental structure. She had governed the empire effectively for over a decade, yet legally she possessed no independent claim to continue ruling after her husband's death. Traditional arrangements would have relegated her to an advisory role at best, with real authority passing to male regents chosen by the courts, senior ministers. The resolution of this dilemma required political maneuvering of extraordinary sophistication. The empress needed to maintain control while appearing to respect established customs, eliminate potential opposition while avoiding actions that might provoke broader resistance, and position herself for long-term authority while managing the immediate challenges of dynastic transition. Li Jie ascended the throne as Emperor Zhongzong, with his mother serving as regent during the initial period of his reign. This arrangement satisfied legal requirements while preserving the empress's effective control over imperial decision-making. Palace announcements emphasized the new sovereign's youth and the necessity of experienced guidance during his adjustment to imperial responsibilities. The young ruler, however, proved less malleable than his mother had anticipated. Zhangzong possessed political ambitions of his own and chafed under the restrictions imposed by regency arrangements. He began asserting independent authority over court appointments and policy decisions, threatening to disrupt the carefully constructed system that had enabled his mother's dominance. The conflict came to a head over the appointment of Waiwan Zhangzhong's father-in-law to a high government position. The empress opposed this nomination, recognizing that it would create an alternative power center within the imperial family that could challenge her authority. When her son insisted on proceeding with the appointment, despite her objections, she understood that more decisive action was required. In February 684, less than 2 months after his coronation, Zhongzong was deposed by his mother and exiled to a remote province. The official justification cited the young emperor's inexperience and his susceptibility to the influence of corrupt advisors who threatened the dynasty's stability. Palace documents described the action as a temporary measure designed to protect imperial authority until more suitable arrangements could be established. Li Dan, the empress's youngest son, was installed as Emperor Ruizong with the understanding that his mother would continue serving as regent indefinitely. This second arrangement proved more satisfactory from the perspective of maintaining established power structures. Ruizong was even younger than his deposed brother and demonstrated less inclination toward independent political action. Yet even this solution remained fundamentally unstable. The Empress understood that ruling through puppet emperors created vulnerabilities that determined opponents could exploit. Her authority depended on the continued acquiescence of sons, who might eventually assert their legal rights to independent rule. Conservative court factions that opposed her influence could rally around the legitimate emperors while challenging the region's unprecedented power. The intelligence network she had developed during the previous decades now proved invaluable in identifying and neutralizing threats before they could mature into active resistance agents. Throughout the governmental apparatus reported on conversations, meetings, and activities that might indicate emerging opposition officials whose loyalty appeared questionable were transferred to positions where they could cause less damage or removed from office entirely. On various pretexts, a series of purges eliminated potential leaders of conservative resistance. The charges brought against targeted officials ranged from corruption and incompetence to treason and conspiracy against the dynasty. Evidence supporting these accusations was invariably discovered by Imperial investigators, who had developed remarkable skill in uncovering compromising information about designated targets. Chu Sui Liang, a respected minister who had served the dynasty for decades, was accused of plotting against the imperial family and exiled to a distant province, where he died in disgrace. Han Yuan, another veteran official who had expressed doubts about the region's expanding authority, was charged with financial irregularities and stripped of all positions. Dozens of lesser functionaries suffered similar fates, as the emperor systematically eliminated anyone who might organize opposition to her rule. The military posed a different category of challenge. Army commanders possessed the physical force necessary to resist imperial authority if they chose to act collectively. However, the Empress had spent years cultivating relationships with key officers and ensuring that potentially unreliable leaders were replaced with individuals who owed their advancement to her patronage. Regional governors represented another potential source of opposition, given their control over provincial resources and their distance from the capital's direct oversight. The Empress addressed this challenge through a combination of incentives and threats that made rebellion extremely costly, while rewarding continued loyalty with substantial benefits. Economic leverage proved particularly effective in maintaining control over distant territories. The Imperial government controlled tax collection, trade regulations, and infrastructure projects that determined the prosperity of individual provinces. Governors who demonstrated appropriate deference found their regions receiving generous investment in roads, irrigation systems, and public buildings. Those who showed signs of independence discovered that their requests for imperial support were delayed or denied entirely. Cultural and religious policies served similar purposes in building broader support for the region's authority. Buddhist monasteries continued receiving generous patronage, creating networks of influential clergy who praised the Empress's wisdom and piety. Confucian scholars were encouraged to develop new interpretations of classical text that could accommodate unprecedented governmental arrangements. The examination system for selecting officials was expanded further, enabling talented individuals from humble backgrounds to advance within the bureaucracy based on demonstrated competence rather than aristocrat connections. This innovation created a class of administrators who owed their positions entirely to imperial favor, and therefore had strong incentives to support the existing regime. Legal reforms continued, improving the status of women in various aspects of civil law, though these changes were implemented gradually to avoid provoking conservative opposition. Marriage contracts were modified to provide wives with greater protection against arbitrary divorce. Inheritance regulations were adjusted to ensure that daughters could claim larger shares of family property under certain circumstances. Agricultural policies remained focused on maintaining adequate food supplies for the empire's enormous population. New irrigation projects were initiated in regions that had previously suffered from periodic droughts. Improved seeds were distributed to farmers in areas where crop yields had been disappointing. Granaries were established in strategic locations to provide relief during times of local famine. Military campaigns during this period successfully expanded Chinese territory while strengthening border defenses against potential invaders. The Empress demonstrated sophisticated understanding of strategic principles, coordinating complex operations across vast distances and exploiting enemy weaknesses through careful timing of offensive actions. Diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms were managed skillfully to advance Chinese interests while avoiding unnecessary conflicts. Foreign rulers recognized that the Tang Empire was being governed by someone who combined ruthless determination with practical wisdom, leading to treaties and alliances that enhanced China's international prestige. By the late 600s and 80s, the Empress had consolidated her authority to an extent that made formal recognition of her power increasingly logical. She ruled the empire in all but name, commanded the loyalty of military forces and civilian administrators, and had eliminated most sources of organized opposition to her continued dominance. The final step in her political evolution required breaking the ultimate taboo of Chinese imperial history. No woman had ever claimed the title of emperor in her own right, ruling as a sovereign rather than a regent or consort. Such an action would challenge fundamental assumptions about gender roles and political authority that had governed Chinese civilization for millennia. Yet, the practical arrangements that had evolved during the Regency made this transition almost inevitable. The Empress already possessed all the substantive powers of imperial rule. Her puppet emperor served no meaningful function beyond satisfying legal formalities that had become increasingly meaningless. The governmental apparatus operated according to her directions rather than his preferences. Conservative opposition to such a development was predictable, but had been systematically weakened through years of purges and intimidation. Military loyalty had been secured through careful personnel policies and generous rewards for reliable commanders. Bureaucratic support had been cultivated through merit-based promotions and expanded opportunities for advancement. The religious justification for female rule was carefully prepared through Buddhist scholarship that emphasized spiritual merit over gender distinctions. Confucian interpretations were developed that could accommodate exceptional circumstances, requiring departures from traditional practices. Historical precedents were cited from earlier periods when empresses had exercised similar authority. In 697 years after her husband's death and 26 years after her return from Guna Temple, the merchant's daughter took the final step in her remarkable ascent. She deposed her son, Emperor Ruizong, assumed the title of emperor herself, and established the Zhou dynasty with herself as its founding ruler. The transformation was complete. A concubine who had once faced exile to a Buddhist convent had become the first and only woman in Chinese history to rule the empire as emperor in her own right. The methods employed to achieve this unprecedented position had been ruthless, but the results were undeniable. The former empress consort was now Emperor Wu Zetian, sovereign of the most powerful civilization on earth. The greatest test of her abilities was about to begin. The proclamation of the Zhou dynasty in 690 marked the culmination of the most audacious political campaign in Chinese history, yet it also initiated the most challenging phase of the merchant's daughter's career. Claiming imperial authority was one achievement. Exercising that power effectively while managing the inevitable resistance was an entirely different challenge. The new emperor faced immediate opposition from multiple sources. Confucian scholars throughout the empire denounced the establishment of female rule as a violation of fundamental natural laws. Military commanders in distant provinces questioned whether they owed allegiance to a dynasty founded on such unprecedented principles. Foreign kingdoms watched carefully for signs of internal weakness that might create opportunities for territorial expansion. The response to these challenges revealed the sophisticated understanding of power that the timber merchant's daughter had developed over 3 decades of political maneuvering, rather than relying solely on coercion. She implemented a comprehensive strategy that combined administrative competence, cultural innovation, and selective brutality to establish her legitimacy as a ruler. The machinery of imperial control was reorganized to serve the specific requirements of female monarchy. Traditional court ceremonies were modified to accommodate a woman occupying the dragon throne, with new protocols developed that maintained imperial dignity while adapting to unprecedented circumstances. Official documents were rewritten to reflect the changed nature of imperial authority, and governmental departments were restructured to ensure efficient implementation of the emperor's decisions. Bureaucratic efficiency reached levels that impressed even critics of the new regime. The examination system was expanded dramatically, creating opportunities for talented individuals from humble backgrounds to advance within the government apparatus based purely on demonstrated competence. This innovation generated a class of administrators who owed their positions entirely to imperial favor and therefore had strong incentives to support the existing arrangements. The intelligence network that had proven so valuable during the Regency period was further expanded and systematized. Agents were placed throughout the empire with specific responsibilities for monitoring potential opposition and reporting on local conditions that might affect imperial stability. This information-gathering apparatus enabled the emperor to identify threats before set. They could mature into active resistance, while also providing valuable intelligence about administrative effectiveness in distant provinces. Propaganda became a crucial element in establishing the legitimacy of female rule. Official historians were commissioned to write accounts that justified the dynasty's founding through references to classical texts and historical precedents. Buddhist scholars developed theological arguments that emphasized spiritual merit over gender distinctions in determining fitness for imperial authority. Confucian intellectuals were encouraged to reinterpret traditional teachings in ways that could accommodate exceptional circumstances, requiring departures from conventional practices. The legal system underwent systematic revision to reflect the changed nature of imperial authority. New laws were promulgated that improved the status of women in various aspects of civil and criminal jurisprudence. Marriage regulations were modified to provide wives with greater protection against arbitrary divorce and domestic violence. Inheritance rules were adjusted to ensure that daughters could claim more substantial shares of family property under specified conditions. Cultural achievements flourished under the patronage of a ruler who understood the importance of artistic accomplishment in establishing dynastic prestige. The Longmen grottos were expanded with additional cave temples that represented some of the finest Buddhist sculpture in Chinese history. Palace architects designed new buildings that reflected both traditional imperial grandeur and innovative approaches to ceremonial space. Educational institutions received generous support as the emperor recognized that governmental effectiveness depended on maintaining a supply of competent administrators. Schools were established in provincial capitals to prepare candidates for the expanded examination system. Libraries were founded in major cities to preserve classical texts, contemporary scholarly works. Academic positions were created for scholars who could contribute to the intellectual development of imperial policies. Military campaigns during this period successfully defended Chinese territory while expanding the empire's influence into Central Asia. The emperor demonstrated a sophisticated grasp of strategic principles, coordinating complex operations across vast distances and exploiting enemy weaknesses through careful timing of offensive actions. Foreign rulers learned to respect the military capabilities of a dynasty that some had initially dismissed as illegitimate. Economic policies implemented under her direction maintained the prosperity that had characterized the Tang period, while adapting to the specific challenges facing the new regime. Tax collection was systematized to reduce corruption and ensure that imperial revenues reached appropriate levels. Trade regulations were modified to encourage commercial activity while preventing the accumulation of excessive wealth by potential opponents of the dynasty. Agricultural development continued, receiving priority attention as the emperor understood that maintaining adequate food supplies for the empire's enormous population was essential for political stability. New irrigation projects were initiated in regions that had previously suffered from periodic droughts. Improved farming techniques were disseminated through governmental programs that provided technical assistance to rural communities. Religious policies carefully balanced support for Buddhism with accommodation of Confucian traditions and popular folk beliefs. Buddhist monasteries continued receiving generous imperial patronage, but Confucian academies were also supported to prevent the complete alienation of traditional scholarly classes. Local temples dedicated to various deities were allowed to operate freely as long as their activities did not challenge imperial authority. The emperor's personal involvement in governmental administration impressed even critics who questioned the legitimacy of her rule. She maintained direct correspondence with provincial governors, personally reviewed judicial decisions involving significant penalties, and conducted regular audiences with officials who sought imperial guidance on policy matters. This hands-on approach to governance ensured that her authority was felt throughout the empire, while demonstrating her competence in managing complex administering of challenges. Opposition to the Zhou dynasty persisted despite these achievements, requiring continued vigilance and occasional harsh measures to maintain stability. Conservative court factions that had never accepted female rule looked for opportunities to restore traditional arrangements. Military commanders in remote regions sometimes tested imperial resolve through various forms of unstable ordination. Provincial officials occasionally attempted to assert greater independence from central control. The response to such challenges was swift and decisive. Officials who demonstrated disloyalty were removed from office and often faced criminal charges related to corruption or treason. Military officers who showed signs of unreliability were transferred to positions where they could cause less damage or were dismissed entirely from imperial service. Provincial governors who failed to implement imperial policies with appropriate efficiency found their careers terminated abruptly. Public trials of prominent dissidents served as warnings to others who might consider resistance. These proceedings were conducted with legal formality, but the outcomes were predetermined by political necessity. Sentences ranged from exile to execution, depending on the severity of the alleged offenses and the requirement to send appropriate messages to potential opponents. The secret police network that had proven so effective during earlier phases of the emperor's rise was further developed to monitor activities throughout the empire. Agents infiltrated governmental departments, military units, religious institutions, and commercial organizations to gather intelligence about potential threats to imperial authority. This surveillance apparatus made organized opposition extremely difficult, while providing the emperor with detailed information about conditions in all parts of her domain. Collective punishment was employed against families and associates of condemned officials to discourage future resistance. Property confiscation, social ostracism, and exclusion from governmental positions ensured that opposing the emperor carried consequences extending far beyond individual punishment. These harsh measures created an atmosphere where challenging imperial authority became virtually impossible for rational individuals who valued their safety and prosperity. Cultural suppression accompanied political repression in cases where traditional practices were deemed incompatible with the requirements of female rule. Confucian ceremonies that emphasized male superiority were modified or eliminated entirely. Historical texts that portrayed women as inherently unsuitable for political leadership were censored or rewritten. Academic discussions that questioned the legitimacy of the current dynasty were prohibited and could result in severe penalties for participants. Yet the emperor also demonstrated remarkable skill in winning voluntary support through policies that benefited large segments of the population. The expanded examination system created opportunities for social advancement that had previously been unavailable to talented individuals from humble backgrounds. Legal reforms improved the position of women and provided better protection for various disadvantaged groups. Economic development projects generated employment while improving living standards in numerous communities. Foreign relations, during this period, reflected the emperor's sophisticated understanding of international politics and her determination to maintain China's status as the dominant power in East Asia. Diplomatic negotiations were conducted with neighboring kingdoms to establish treaties that served Chinese interests while avoiding unnecessary conflicts. Military demonstrations along various frontiers reminded potential enemies that the empire possessed the strength to defend its territory effectively. Trade relationships were cultivated carefully to enhance Chinese prosperity while preventing excessive dependence on foreign commerce. Luxury goods from distant regions were imported to satisfy elite preferences, but essential commodities remained under domestic control. To ensure imperial security, commercial regulations were designed to encourage legitimate business activity, while preventing the smuggling and other illegal practices that could undermine governmental authority. The emperor's personal character combined ruthless determination with genuine intellectual curiosity and cultural sophistication. She patronized artists, scholars, and religious figures who contributed to the dynasty's cultural achievements, while eliminating anyone who threatened its political stability. Her court became a center of learning and artistic creation that attracted talented individuals from throughout the empire and beyond. By the end of the 7th century, the Zhou dynasty had established itself as a legitimate and effective governmental system. Despite the unprecedented nature of its founding, the emperor had demonstrated that competent administration, rather than gender or traditional legitimacy, determined successful rule. Her achievements in expanding the empire, maintaining internal stability, and fostering cultural development provided concrete evidence that female leadership could produce results equal to, or superior to, those achieved by male predecessors. Yet even these accomplishments could not entirely eliminate the challenges inherent in ruling an empire founded on such revolutionary principles. conservative opposition remained latent throughout Chinese society, ready to emerge whenever imperial strength showed signs of weakness. The emperor's advancing age raised questions about succession that had no clear answers within existing legal frameworks. Foreign enemies continued testing Chinese resolve through various provocations along distant frontiers. The merchant's daughter, who had become emperor of China, had achieved the impossible through intelligence, determination, and ruthless calculation. Now, she faced the challenge of maintaining these achievements while preparing for an uncertain future that would determine whether her revolution-free reign represented a permanent transformation of Chinese politics or merely a temporary aberration in the empire's long history. The emperor, who had seized power through calculated ruthlessness and maintained authority through systematic intimidation, discovered it as she, entered her 70s. That age brought vulnerabilities that no amount of political skill could entirely overcome. The woman who had eliminated rivals, crushed opposition, and commanded the obedience of 50 million subjects, found herself increasingly dependent on companions whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned through respect or fear. Zhang Yizhai and Zhang Changzong entered the imperial court in the year 700 as minor functionaries whose primary qualifications were their youth, physical attractiveness, and willingness to provide the aging ruler with personal companionship that transcended political considerations. Both men possessed adequate education and social refinement, but their rapid advancement within the palace hierarchy clearly resulted from factors other than administrative competence or demonstrated loyalty to dynastic interests. The relationship that developed between the emperor and these young favorites represented a fundamental departure from the calculated political partnership that had characterized her earlier career. For the first time since her rise to power, the merchant's daughter allowed personal emotions to influence governmental decisions in ways that undermined the careful strategic thinking that had enabled her unprecedented achievements. Zhang Yizhi, the elder of the two brothers, possessed considerable charm and intelligence that initially made his influence seem less problematic to court observers. He demonstrated genuine interest in poetry, philosophy, and the cultural activities that had always appealed to the emperor's intellectual curiosity. Their conversations ranged across topics from classical literature to administrative theory, creating an illusion that this relationship served legitimate advisory purposes. Zhang Zhangzong, younger and more physically striking than his brother, appealed primarily to emotional needs that the emperor had suppressed throughout decades of political maneuvering. The ruthless calculation that had enabled her rise to power had required constant vigilance against personal attachments that might create vulnerabilities now, in her declining years. She seemed determined to experience the romantic companionship that her earlier career had made impossible. The favoritism shown to these men created scandal throughout the empire and provided ammunition for opponents who had never accepted the legitimacy of female rule. Conservative officials, who had remained silent during the emperor's most effective periods, now began expressing concern about governmental corruption and the inappropriate influence of unsuitable advisors. Military commanders questioned whether they owed allegiance to a ruler whose judgment appeared compromised by personal relationships. Palace intrigue intensified as the Zhang brothers consolidated their positions and began advancing their own interests at the expense of established governmental procedures. Appointments to important positions increasingly reflected their recommendations rather than merit-based valuations. Financial resources were diverted to projects that served their personal enrichment rather than imperial objectives. Policy decisions were influenced by considerations related to their comfort and status rather than the empire's long-term welfare. The intelligence network that had served the emperor so effectively throughout her reign began reporting disturbing information about the brothers' active cities and their growing influence over imperial decision-making. Agents throughout the governmental apparatus observed meetings where policy was discussed. Matters were discussed without appropriate consultation with experienced administrators. Military preparations were modified to accommodate the favorites' preferences rather than strategic necessities. Diplomatic negotiations were conducted with insufficient attention to Chinese interests. Yet the emperor seemed unwilling or unable to recognize the dangers posed by her emotional dependence on these companions. Officials who attempted to raise concerns about the brothers' influence found their access to imperial audiences restricted or eliminated entirely. Ministers, who had served the dynasty faithfully for decades, discovered that their advice was being ignored in favor of recommendations from individuals whose qualifications were questionable at best. The deterioration in governmental effectiveness became apparent through various indicators that would have prompted immediate corrective action. During earlier periods of the emperor's reign, tax collection efficiency declined as provincial administrators understood that imperial attention was focused elsewhere. Military discipline suffered as commanders recognized that advancement depended more on political connections than professional competence. Diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms became strained as foreign rulers questioned whether agreements negotiated with the current regime would remain binding. Economic set. Problems emerged as resources were allocated to serve the interests of court favorites rather than genuine imperial needs. Construction projects of dubious value consumed enormous amounts of labor and materials, while essential infrastructure maintenance was deferred. Trade regulations were modified to benefit commercial enterprises associated with the Jiang brothers, creating market distortions that damaged broader economic development. Cultural achievements that had flourished under imperial patronage during earlier periods began declining as support was redirected toward activities that pleased the emperor's companions rather than serving lasting artistic or intellectual purposes. Scholarly institutions found their funding reduced, while resources were devoted to entertainment and luxury consumption that provided no permanent benefits to Chinese civilization. The emperor's physical health also began showing signs of deterioration that affected her capacity for the demanding work of imperial administration. The woman, who had once maintained direct correspondence with provincial governors and personally reviewed complex policy documents, had a deep understanding of the issues that affected the lives of the people in the region. Now, delegated increasing responsibility to subordinates whose competence was uncertain. Palace physicians reported episodes of confusion and memory loss that interfered with sustained concentration on governmental matters. These medical problems created opportunities for the Jiang brothers to expand their influence by positioning themselves as essential intermediaries between the aging ruler and the administrative apparatus she had previously controlled directly. They began screening documents before they reached imperial attention, filtering information to prevent the emperor from learning about problems that might require difficult decisions or unpleasant confrontations. Opposition to the brothers' influence gradually coalesced around court officials who recognized that the dynasty's survival depended on restoring effective governmental procedures. These individuals understood that direct confrontation with the emperor's favorites would likely result in their own destruction, but they also realized that continued deterioration in administrative competence threatened the empire's stability and their own long-term interests. Military commanders proved particularly concerned about the erosion of imperial authority and its potential consequences for border security. The empire faced continuing threats from nomadic tribes along northern frontiers and ambitious neighboring kingdoms that might exploit any signs of Chinese weakness. Effective defense required coordinated planning and resource allocation that seemed increasingly unlikely under current arrangements. Provincial governors reported growing problems with local administration as confusion about imperial priorities made it difficult to implement consistent policies. Instructions from the capital often contradicted previous directives or reflected insufficient understanding of regional conditions. The examination system that had been expanded so successfully during earlier periods of the emperor's reign began producing officials whose advancement seemed to depend more on personal connections than demonstrated competence. Religious institutions that had benefited from imperial patronage during the dynasty's founding period found their support reduced as resources were diverted to serve the preferences of court favorites. Buddhist monasteries that had served as important sources of political legitimacy for female rule began questioning whether they should continue endorsing a regime that appeared to be abandoning the principles that had justified its revolutionary origins. Foreign relations suffered as diplomatic negotiations were conducted by individuals who lacked the knowledge and experience necessary for effective international relations. Treaties that had maintained peaceful relationships with neighboring kingdoms began breaking down as foreign rulers lost confidence in the Chinese government's reliability and competence. Military preparations along various frontiers became necessary to address threats that might have been avoided through skillful diplomacy. The emperor herself seemed increasingly isolated from the realities of imperial governance, as the Jiang brothers created a protective barrier that shielded her from unpleasant information while enabling their continued manipulation of governmental processes. Palace routines were reorganized to maximize their access to imperial attention while minimizing contact with officials who might provide accurate assessments of developing problems. Court ceremonies were modified to accommodate the brothers' preferences and enhance their status within the palace hierarchy. Traditional protocols that had emphasized the dignity and authority of imperial office were altered to reflect the changed dynamics of palace relationships. These innovations scandalized conservative observers while providing additional evidence that the emperor's judgment had been compromised by inappropriate personal attachments. The contrast between the current situation and the emperor's earlier achievements became increasingly apparent to courtiers, who remembered the decisive leadership and administrative competence that had characterized her rise to power. The woman, who had eliminated rivals through careful calculation and maintained authority through systematic control, maintained her position through a combination of strategic planning and effective leadership, now appeared vulnerable to manipulation by individuals whose primary qualifications were their ability to provide personal companionship. Intelligence reports indicated that opposition groups were beginning to coordinate their activities and explore options for addressing the crisis in imperial leadership. Military commanders met privately to discuss their concerns about governmental effectiveness and border security. Court officials exchanged communications about the need for action to preserve dynastic stability. Provincial administrators began preparing for potential disruptions in central authority. The Zhang brothers, meanwhile, continued to consolidate their positions and advancing their personal interests, without apparent recognition of the broader forces that their influence was generating. They surrounded themselves with supporters and clients who benefited from their access to imperial favor, creating a network of individuals whose prosperity depended on maintaining current arrangements, regardless of their impact on governmental effectiveness. By 704, the situation had deteriorated to the point where even the emperor's most loyal supporters began questioning whether the dynasty could survive continued governance under existing conditions. The intelligence network that had once provided her with decisive advantages in eliminating opposition now carried reports of growing dissatisfaction throughout the empire and increasing coordination among potential challenges to her authority. The merchant's daughter, who had transferred, formed herself into the most powerful ruler in Chinese history, faced the possibility that her greatest achievements might be undone by the personal weaknesses that had emerged during her declining years. The question was no longer whether opposition would emerge, but whether she possessed sufficient strength to survive the challenges that were rapidly approaching. The answer would determine not only her personal fate, but the future of the revolutionary dynasty she had created through decades of unprecedented political innovation. The conspiracy that would end the most revolutionary reign in Chinese history began forming in the winter of 704. When 5 court officials met secretly to discuss the crisis and imperial governance and explore options for preserving dynastic stability. Zhang Junji, Jing Hui, One Young Fan Yuan Shuji, and Question One Wei represented different factions within the governmental apparatus, but they shared a common recognition that the empire's survival required immediate action to address the deteriorating situation at court. These men possessed impeccable credentials for evaluating the political crisis that confronted the dynasty. Zhang Genji had served in various administrative positions for over 2 decades and understood the requirements of effective governance. Jing Hui commanded respect among military officers and could assess the security implications of continued governmental dysfunction. Huan Yangfan maintained extensive connections with provincial administrators and recognized the growing dissatisfaction in distant regions. Yuan Shuji and Kui Wenwei represented scholarly and aristocratic perspectives that provided additional insights into the broader challenges facing imperial authority. Their analysis of the situation was devastating in its clarity. The emperor's dependence on the Zhang brothers had created a parallel governmental structure that bypassed established procedures and ignored institutional safeguards developed over centuries of Chinese political evolution. Policy decisions were being made by individuals who lacked the knowledge, experience, and legitimate authority necessary for effective administration. Resources were being diverted from essential imperial functions to serve the personal interests of court favorites, whose qualifications remained questionable. More significantly, the conspiracy's leaders understood that the current crisis threatened to destroy credit to the entire concept of female rule and potentially destroy the governmental innovations that had represented the emperor's most valuable contributions to Chinese civilization. The examination system, administrative reforms, and legal improvements that had enhanced imperial effectiveness might be abandoned if the dynasty collapsed amid scandal and incompetence. The conspirators recognized that direct confrontation with the emperor would be futile. Given her continued control over palace security and the loyalty she commanded from certain segments of the military. However, they also understood that eliminating the Jiang brothers might restore her capacity for effective decision-making while removing the primary source of governmental corruption and administrative dysfunction. Intelligence gathering revealed that the brothers' influence depended entirely on their personal relationship with the aging ruler rather than any independent power base within the imperial system. They possessed no significant military support, limited financial resources beyond what they received through imperial favor, and few allies among established court officials. Their position was strong only as long as they maintained exclusive access to the emperor and could prevent other advisors from providing alternative perspectives on policy matters. The conspiracy required careful timing to maximize its chances of success while minimizing the risk of discovery. The emperor's declining health created periods when her attention was diverted from routine administrative matters, providing opportunities for coordinated action that might not be immediately detected. Palace routines could be manipulated to isolate the Jiang brothers at moments when their usual security arrangements were weakened. Military support was secured through discreet communications with commanders who shared concerns about the empire's deteriorating security posture and the need for more effective leadership. These officers were not informed about specific operational details, but they were prepared to maintain order during any period of transition that might result from changes in court, personnel, or governmental procedures. The decisive moment arrived in February 705, when the emperor's physical condition provided the opening that the conspirators had been awaiting. Palace physicians reported that she was experiencing severe health problems that required extended periods of rest and medical treatment. The Jiang brothers, confident in their control over access to imperial audiences, were determined to play a key role in the imperial court, reduced their usual vigilance while focusing on managing the crisis in the ruler's health. The coordinated action began before dawn on February 20th, when loyal palace guards moved simultaneously to arrest both brothers and their principal supporters. The operation was conducted with precision that prevented any organized resistance or attempts to alert the emperor to what was occurring within hours. The individuals who had dominated court politics for the previous 5 years were in custody and facing charges related to corruption, incompetence, and abuse of imperial authority. The emperor, when informed of these developments, initially demanded the immediate release of her companions and the punishment of those responsible for their arrest. However, the conspirators had prepared comprehensive documentation of the brothers' activities and their impact on governmental effectiveness. Financial records revealed the extent of their personal enrichment through misuse of imperial resources. Administrative reports demonstrated how their influence had compromised policy implementation and damaged the empire's interests. More importantly, the conspirators presented evidence that the Jiang brothers had been actively planning to eliminate potential opponents and consolidate their control over the succession process. Documents seized during their arrest indicated discussions about removing court officials who posed threats to their continued influence. Communications suggested coordination with individuals who might support their efforts to maintain power even after the current emperor's death. Confronted with this evidence, and isolated from the advisors who had shaped her thinking for the previous 5 years, the merchant's daughter began recognizing the extent to which her judgment had been compromised by personal attachments. The woman who had once eliminated rivals through careful calculation acknowledged that she had allowed emotional considerations to override the strategic thinking that had enabled her unprecedented rise to power. The Jiang brothers were executed within days of their arrest, along with several dozen associates who had participated in the corruption of imperial governance. The proceedings were conducted with legal formality, but the outcomes reflected political necessity rather than judicial procedure. The death eliminated the primary source of recent governmental dysfunction, while sending clear messages about the consequences of exploiting imperial favor for personal enrichment. Yet the elimination of the Jiang brothers could not restore the emperor's authority to its previous levels. The damage to her reputation and the demonstration of her vulnerability had emboldened opposition groups throughout the empire. Provincial governors began asserting greater independence from central control. Military set. Commanders started making decisions without seeking imperial approval. Court officials resumed the factional conflicts that had been suppressed during earlier periods of more effective leadership. The conspiracies leaders recognized that permanent stability required more fundamental changes in governmental arrangements. The emperor's advancing age and declining health made it increasingly unlikely that she could resume the hands-on administration that had characterized her most successful periods. Succession planning had been complicated by the revolutionary nature of her reign and the absence of clear precedents for transferring power from a female emperor to male, as negotiations with the emperor regarding the terms of her abdication were conducted with respect for her achievements. While acknowledging the practical necessities of the current situation, the conspirators emphasized their desire to preserve the governmental innovations she had implemented while restoring the dynastic legitimacy that had been strained by recent developments. They proposed arrangements that would allow her to retain ceremonial honors while transferring effective authority to her son, Le Shon, who would resume the throne as emperor. Shongzong. The abdication was announced in February 705, less than a month after the elimination of the Zhang brothers' official proclamation emphasized the emperor's desire to focus on personal spiritual development. After decades of devoted service to the empire, the transition was described as a voluntary decision motivated by concerns for dynastic stability rather than the result of political pressure or physical incapacity. Lesions, restoration. As emperor, Shongzong marked the formal end of the Zhou dynasty and the resumption of Tang rule. The new sovereign immediately began implementing changes designed to restore traditional governmental procedures while preserving selected innovations that had proven beneficial during his mother's reign. The examination system was maintained and expanded further. Legal reforms that had improved the status of women and other disadvantaged groups were largely retained. Administrative practices that had enhanced governmental efficiency were continued under modified forms. The former emperor was granted the title of Empress Dowager and provided with comfortable quarters in the Shangyang Palace, where she would spend her remaining months under what amounted to elegant house arrest. Her movements were restricted. Her communications were monitored, and her contact with former supporters was severely limited. Yet she was treated with the courtesy appropriate to her previous rank and allowed to maintain the dignity befitting someone who had ruled the empire for 15 years. Death came to the merchant's daughter in December 705, less than a year after her abdication, and exactly 22 years after her husband's death had initiated her rise to unprecedented power. Palace physicians attributed her death to natural causes related to her advanced age and declining health, though some observers speculated about other factors that might have hastened her demise. The funeral arrangements reflected the complex legacy of her reign and the ambivalent attitudes of those who succeeded her. She was buried beside Emperor Gaozong in the Channeling Mausoleum, acknowledging her status as his wife, while avoiding explicit recognition of her independent imperial authority. The tomb complex itself was magnificent, befitting someone who had occupied the highest position in Chinese government. Yet the inscriptions were carefully crafted to emphasize her traditional roles rather than her revolutionary achievements. Most significantly, her tombstone was left entirely blank. No name was carved into the stone. No titles were listed. No achievements were commemorated. The absence of inscription was officially explained as reflecting appropriate modesty and the impossibility of adequately summarizing such a complex life in simple text. However, the blank stone more likely represented the successor dynasty's uncertainty about how to acknowledge her reign without legitimizing the precedent she had established. The historical assessment of her achievements began immediately after her death and continued for a century as Chinese scholars struggled to understand and evaluate her unprecedented career. Confucian historians, committed to traditional principles of male political authority, generally portrayed her as a usurper who had temporarily disrupted the natural order of imperial succession. They emphasized her ruthless methods while minimizing her administrative accomplishments and the genuine benefits that Chinese civilization had derived from her innovations. Buddhist scholars and writers who had benefited from her patronage offered more favorable evaluations that emphasized her spiritual wisdom and her contributions to religious development. They argued that her gender was irrelevant to assessments of her effectiveness as a ruler and pointed to the prosperity and cultural achievements that had characterized her reign. Foreign observers, particularly those from kingdoms that had negotiated with her government, generally acknowledged her competence as a diplomat and military leader, regardless of their opinions about the legitimacy of female rule. Treaties negotiated during her reign remained binding, and territorial agreements established under her authority continued to define international boundaries for generations. The governmental innovations she had implemented proved more durable than the dynasty she had founded. The examination system continued evolving and expanding, eventually becoming the primary mechanism for selecting Chinese officials for over a millennium. Legal reforms that had improved the status of women and other groups remained largely intact. Administrative procedures that had enhanced governmental efficiency were retained and further developed by successor dynasties. Perhaps most importantly, her reign had demonstrated that effective governance depended on competence and intelligence rather than gender or traditional legitimacy, while no other woman would achieve similar authority in Chinese history. The precedent she had established influenced attitudes toward female political participation and challenged assumptions about natural limitations on women's capabilities. The economic prosperity that had characterized her reign provided evidence that her policies had served Chinese interests effectively. Agricultural development had maintained adequate food supplies for the empire's enormous population. Trade relationships had enhanced Chinese wealth while preserving essential security interests. Infrastructure projects had improved transportation and communication throughout the empire. Cultural achievements during her reign represented some of the finest expressions of Chinese artistic and intellectual creativity. The Long Men grottos remained among the most impressive Buddhist monuments in Asian art. Literary and scholarly works produced under her patronage continued influencing Chinese culture for centuries. Educational institutions she had supported provided foundations for intellectual development that benefited future generations. Military campaigns conducted under her direction had successfully defended Chinese territory while expanding the empire's influence in Central Asia. Foreign rulers had learned to respect Chinese power and negotiate seriously with her government. Border security had been maintained effectively despite challenges from various nomadic groups and ambitious neighboring kingdoms. The intelligence network she had developed provided models for information gathering and political control that influenced Chinese governmental practices for centuries. While the specific methods she had employed were often criticized as excessive, the principle of systematic intelligence collection became an accepted element of imperial administration. Her religious policies had demonstrated that effective governance could accommodate diverse belief systems without compromising imperial authority. Buddhist institutions had flourished under her patronage, while Confucian traditions had been preserved and adapted to changing circumstances. Popular religious practices had been allowed to continue as long as they did not challenge governmental stability. The blank tombstone that marked her grave became a symbol of historical ambivalence about her legacy. Rather than a successful attempt to erase her memory, later generations of Chinese continued debating her achievements and methods, ensuring that her story remained alive in popular consciousness. Despite official efforts to minimize her significance, modern historical scholarship has generally acknowledged that her reign represented a remarkable achievement in governmental effectiveness and administrative innovation. While her methods were often brutal by contemporary standards, they were not notably different from those employed by male rulers of her era. Her willingness to eliminate opposition and her use of systematic intimidation reflected the practical requirements of maintaining authority in a political system that had no established procedures for female rule. The examination system she expanded became one of China's most important contributions to world civilization, providing a model for merit-based governmental selection that influenced administrative practices in numerous countries. Her legal reforms represented early steps toward gender equality that preceded similar developments in most other societies by centuries. Her patronage of Buddhism and religious tolerance generally provided alternatives to the rigid social hierarchies that Confucian orthodoxy had traditionally supported. While her policies were motivated primarily by political considerations rather than philosophical commitments, their practical effects enhanced opportunities for social mobility and cultural diversity. The merchant's daughter, who had transformed herself into the most powerful ruler in Chinese history, had proven that intelligence, determination, and political skill could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Her rise from concubine to emperor represented one of the most extraordinary examples of individual achievement in human history. Accomplished through methods that were both admirable and appalling, the blank tombstone continues to stand in the Channeling Mausoleum, its silence speaking more eloquently than any inscription could about the revolutionary nature of her reign and the enduring uncertainty about how such unprecedented achievements should be remembered. The woman who had rewritten the rules of Chinese politics had also challenged fundamental culture, assumptions about human capability and social organization that remained relevant long after her death. Her story endures not merely as historical curiosity, but as testimony to the possibilities that emerge when conventional limitations are rejected in favor of unlimited ambition. Guided by superior intelligence, the merchant's daughter had proven that the most ancient certainties could be overturned by someone who understood power better than those who had inherited it through accident of birth. The blank stone bears witness to a life that defied summary, a reign that challenged explanation and achievements that transcended the categories available to those who came after. In its silence, the tombstone acknowledges what words could never adequately express, that some individuals reshape the world so fundamentally that conventional language becomes insufficient to describe their impact on human civilization.